Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating and least known stories of the European Middle Ages, the underground economy of charcoal, the invisible fuel that warmed entire cities, forged empires of iron, and, at the same time, devoured ancient forests. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine a dense forest in the heart of Europe, sometime between the 11th and 13th centuries. The air is cold, the sunlight can barely penetrate the canopy, and yet something unexpected happens in this seemingly untouched setting. A column of greyish smoke rises slowly between the trunks of oak and beech trees. It is not the sign of a forest fire. It is not the campfire of a lost traveller. It is the silent and meticulous work of a man whom few knew by name, but upon whom an entire civilization depended, a charcoal burner, a maker of charcoal, an artisan of controlled fire, who lived on the fringes of society to feed the invisible engine of a world in full transformation. To understand the importance of this character and the product he created, one must first understand the broader stage upon which this story unfolds. Medieval Europe, especially from the 11th century onward, was experiencing a period of unprecedented expansion. Populations were growing, cities were multiplying, and the demand for natural resources reached levels that the infrastructure of the time could barely keep up with. In this context, a fundamental question imposed itself with increasing urgency: how to produce enough heat to sustain this expansion? The answer, for centuries, was a single word: charcoal. Not mineral coal, which would only find its place of prominence many centuries later, but charcoal, the product of the controlled transformation of wood into a high-energy density fuel. Wood, in itself, was an abundant resource in medieval Europe. Forests covered vast stretches of the continent, providing raw material for the construction of houses, ships, mills, carts, and countless other everyday objects. However, wood in its natural state had a fundamental limitation when it came to generating intense heat. It was simply not capable of reaching the temperatures necessary for the industrial activities that sustained the medieval economy. Iron smelting, glass-making, lime production, and the work of blacksmiths required a level of heat that ordinary firewood could not provide efficiently or consistently. A more concentrated, more potent fuel was needed, capable of burning at high temperatures and for prolonged periods, and that fuel was charcoal. Charcoal, in simple terms, is the result of a process called pyrolysis, in which wood is heated in an environment with little or no oxygen. Under these conditions, the volatile compounds in the wood are eliminated, leaving behind a substance composed almost entirely of pure carbon. This material, light, porous, and intense black in color, possessed remarkable properties. Its capacity to generate heat was significantly superior to that of raw wood. While firewood burned irregularly and at relatively modest temperatures, charcoal burned uniformly and reached temperatures that could exceed 350 degrees Celsius, 662 degrees Fahrenheit, in the carbonization process itself. When used in furnaces and forges with bellows systems for air injection, these temperatures could be raised to much higher levels, reaching over 1,000 degrees Celsius, 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit, levels absolutely indispensable for smelting and ironwork. It is difficult for the contemporary observer to scale how much this temperature difference meant to medieval society. Without charcoal, there would be no worked iron. Without worked iron, there would be no nails, hinges, agricultural tools, horseshoes, chains, locks, weapons, armor, or any of the countless metal objects that sustained both daily life and the military and political structure of the era. Charcoal was not just one fuel among others. It was the energetic foundation upon which the entire medieval civilization was built. And yet, the production of this essential material was an extraordinarily complex, dangerous, and time-consuming process. It all began in the forest, where the charcoal burner carefully selected the trees to be used. Different species of wood produced charcoal of distinct qualities. Oak and beech were particularly valued for their density and the superior quality of the charcoal they generated. The selection of wood was not a trivial detail. An experienced charcoal burner knew that the wrong choice could compromise entire weeks of work. After selecting and cutting the trees, The trunks were sectioned into logs of uniform length, generally about 1 meter, 3.3 feet. These logs were then stacked vertically in a conical formation around a central post, which served as a chimney. The construction of this pile, known in many regions as a mylar or charcoal kiln, was a true work of rustic engineering. Smaller and thinner logs were placed on the outside of the pile, while the larger and denser ones occupied the center. This arrangement was not random. Each log had a precise position, determined by knowledge passed down from generation to generation, to ensure that carbonization occurred uniformly throughout the structure. Once the assembly of the pile was completed, it was covered with a layer of brushwood, leaves, moss, and grass, followed by a final layer of damp earth and clay. This covering had an absolutely crucial function: to prevent the entry of oxygen. If air penetrated the pile in an uncontrolled manner, the wood would not carbonize. Instead, it would enter full combustion and turn into ash, destroying weeks of work in a matter of hours. Sealing the pile was, therefore, a stage that required meticulous attention and experienced hands. With the pile sealed, the charcoal burner began the ignition process. Embers were introduced through the upper opening, the central chimney, and a slow combustion began to propagate through the interior of the structure. From that moment on, the charcoal burner entered a state of constant vigilance that could last from 6 to 8 days in smaller piles and several weeks in larger structures. Throughout this period, he needed to incessantly monitor the color and density of the smoke, escaping through small openings carefully positioned along the pile. It was through the observation of the smoke that the charcoal burner assessed the progress of carbonization. Thick, grayish smoke indicated that the wood was still raw, that the process was in its early stages. Thinner, bluish smoke signaled that carbonization was progressing properly. This monitoring was not a passive task. The charcoal burner needed to intervene constantly, opening and closing small holes in the earth covering to regulate the airflow inside the pile. If the flow was insufficient, carbonization could go out. If it was excessive, the pile could burst into open flame and be destroyed. The balance was delicate, and the margin for error was minimal. A charcoal burner needed years of experience to master this art, and even the most skilled lost entire piles from time to time, victims of sudden changes in the wind or a moment of inattention during the long nights of vigil. And the nights were long. The charcoal burner could not stray from his pile during the carbonization process. He slept in improvised shelters, built with branches, leaves, and mud, just a few meters away from the smoking structure. His food was simple and often scarce. His company, most of the time, was only the sound of the forest and the muffled crackle of wood slowly turning into charcoal. This solitary life, far from villages and towns, gave charcoal burners a peculiar reputation in medieval society. They were marginal figures, frequently associated with superstitions and fears on the part of the urban and rural population. Their profession was considered dishonorable in many regions, and they lived as true social pariahs, accepted by the community only insofar as their product was indispensable. Charcoal burners were recognizable from a distance. Their skin and clothes were permanently impregnated with soot and charcoal dust. The smell of wood smoke followed them like a second skin. A medieval chronicler described the typical charcoal burner as a man whose face and hands were so encrusted with charcoal dust that the folds of his clothes became stiff and uniform. This somber appearance and the isolation in which they lived fueled legends and superstitions. In some regions of Europe, charcoal burners were seen as practitioners of dark arts, figures who had made some kind of pact with the forces of the forest. The reality, evidently, was much more prosaic and much harder than any legend could suggest. But why did these men submit to such an arduous and marginalized life? The answer lies in the charcoal economy and its importance for the survival of medieval cities. Charcoal was a product of extraordinary value. Without it, the blacksmith's forges would go cold. Without it, the smelting furnaces would remain unlit. Without it, there would be no tools to plough the land, weapons to defend the cities, or nails to build the roofs of houses. Demand was constant and growing, driven by the population growth and urban expansion that characterized the central centuries of the Middle Ages. The charcoal supply chain was a logistical operation of surprising scale. To produce a relatively modest amount of charcoal, it was necessary to consume a much larger volume of wood. Generally speaking, several kilograms of wood were required to produce a single kilogram of charcoal. This unfavorable ratio meant that charcoal production on a scale sufficient to supply a medieval city required the consumption of enormous quantities of forest raw materials. The transport of charcoal from the production sites, usually located deep in the forests, to the urban centers of consumption, was another complex and expensive operation. Charcoal, although lighter than raw wood, was a fragile material that shattered easily during transport. Caravans of pack animals, usually mules and donkeys, traveled narrow and muddy forest trails carrying sacks and baskets of charcoal on long journeys to the cities. These transport routes created a logistical network parallel to traditional trade routes, a kind of hidden circulatory system that kept the medieval urban economy alive. Control over the forest lots where charcoal was produced became, over the centuries, a matter of political and economic power of primary importance. Feudal lords, monasteries, bishops, and, in some cases, the crown itself disputed the right to exploit forests for charcoal production. In regions like the Weald, in southeast England, charcoal production was so important that it was regulated by specific local laws and customs. The possession of a productive forest was, in many cases, more valuable than the possession of agricultural land, as charcoal generated constant revenue and fed industries that in turn sustained entire cities. This forest economy created complex social and environmental dynamics that deserve careful examination. In many regions of Europe, peasants developed remarkably sophisticated forest management systems to ensure a continuous supply of wood for charcoal production. The most widespread technique was the so-called coppicing system, in which trees were cut periodically but not uprooted. The remaining stumps would sprout again, producing new shoots that could be cut after a few years of growth. This cycle of cutting and regrowth allowed the same forest area to provide wood sustainably over decades or even centuries. Archaeological research conducted in various regions of Europe has demonstrated that when charcoal production was in the hands of the forest-dwelling peasants themselves, it tended to be practiced in a relatively sustainable manner. The peasants preferentially used wood from coppicing, cutting fast-growing trees such as hazel, birch, and alder, which regenerated easily. This practice kept the forest productive and allowed charcoal production to continue indefinitely without exhausting natural resources. However, the situation changed radically when charcoal production was driven by large landowners. Studies conducted by the archaeologist Arne Payson, particularly in the region of Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany, revealed that when feudal lords took control of charcoal production, the methods were drastically different. Instead of using coppiced wood, the large landowners ordered the felling of ancient large-scale trees, which produced superior quality charcoal, but whose regeneration took decades or even centuries. This practice resulted in massive and unsustainable deforestation, transforming ancient, dense forests into land devoid of vegetation cover. And here we begin to glimpse one of the darker aspects of this story. The growing demand for charcoal, driven by the urban and industrial expansion of the Middle Ages, exerted ever greater pressure on European forests. In regions where production was conducted sustainably, the balance was maintained, at least for a while. But in areas where exploitation was more intense and less careful, the signs of exhaustion began to appear with increasing clarity from the 12th century onward. Before we move further in that direction, however, it is important to understand in more depth the final destination of the charcoal produced in the forests and the way it transformed medieval cities. The primary consumer of charcoal was, undoubtedly, metallurgy. The medieval blacksmith was a central figure in any community, from the smallest village to the largest urban centers. Practically every town in medieval Europe had its own forge and its full-time blacksmith, whose workshop was one of the busiest and most important spots in the locality. In the medieval forge, charcoal was the exclusive fuel. It was deposited in the stone hearth that constituted the heart of the workshop and lit with the aid of bellows, mechanical devices that injected compressed air into the base of the fire. Charcoal, fueled by this constant flow of oxygen, reached extraordinary temperatures. The blacksmith controlled the heat by regulating the intensity of the bellows, a process that required considerable skill and experience. The temperature of the metal was assessed by its color, from the initial dark red, moving through bright red, yellow, and finally incandescent white. Each shade indicated a specific level of heat and determined the type of work that could be performed at that moment. Iron, unlike other metals such as bronze, did not pass directly from a solid to a liquid state. Instead, as the temperature rose, it became progressively more malleable, acquiring a plastic consistency that allowed the blacksmith to shape it with hammer and anvil. This unique property of iron was what made possible the production of an almost infinite variety of objects, from tiny nails to elaborate swords. But all of this depended on a single fundamental condition: the presence of high-quality charcoal in the forge. The process of smelting iron from raw ore, known as reduction, was even more dependent on charcoal. Medieval smelting furnaces, called bloomeries, were relatively simple structures built of stone or clay, in which alternating layers of iron ore and charcoal were stacked and then subjected to extreme temperatures. Charcoal played a dual role here. In addition to providing the heat necessary to melt the ore, the carbon present in the charcoal reacted chemically with the iron oxide, separating the pure metal from the slag, the mineral impurities. Without this chemical reaction, the transformation of ore into usable iron would be simply impossible. The product of this process was a spongy and irregular mass of iron called a bloom. This bloom needed to be reheated in charcoal and hammered repeatedly to expel remaining impurities, an exhausting job that could take days. The result was what is called wrought iron, a material of remarkable quality that, in some cases, would only be matched by the industrial production of the 19th century. And when the carbon from the charcoal was absorbed by the iron in specific proportions during the heating process, the result was something even more valuable: steel, an alloy harder and more resistant than pure iron, capable of maintaining a sharp edge and withstanding impacts that would cause ordinary iron to deform or break. But metallurgy, although it was the primary consumer, was far from being the only destination for medieval charcoal. Glassmaking, for example, required high temperatures that only charcoal could provide consistently. The production of lime, an essential material for masonry construction, likewise depended on the burning of charcoal in specific kilns. Breweries used charcoal in their production processes, and, on a smaller scale, charcoal was also used for domestic heating and cooking, although for these purposes, ordinary firewood was generally sufficient and more accessible. This diversity of uses meant that the demand for charcoal was constant and multifaceted. Different industries competed for the same resource, and in periods of greater economic or military activity, this competition could become fierce. In times of war, the demand for weapons, armor, arrowheads, horseshoes, and siege tools skyrocketed. Medieval armies consumed enormous quantities of wood for the construction of siege engines, palisades, and camps, while simultaneously depending on charcoal to feed their field forges. Prolonged conflicts, such as the 100 Years' War between England and France, amplified these pressures across vast regions of Western Europe. Armies operating in northern France repeatedly consumed forest resources, while disrupting the normal management of forests and rural estates. The destruction of villages and agricultural infrastructure further reduced the capacity of local communities to maintain their forest resources, producing long-term shortages that affected regional economies for decades. It is at this point in the narrative that the history of medieval charcoal begins to reveal its deepest and most lasting consequences. Urban and industrial expansion, coupled with military demands and the not always sustainable management of forests, was leading medieval Europe toward an energy crisis of alarming proportions. And this crisis, although it developed slowly over centuries, would eventually radically transform the landscape, the economy, and even the technological trajectory of the continent. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, one must observe what was happening to European forests. Deforestation in Europe did not begin in the Middle Ages. Since Roman times, vast areas of forest had been cleared to make way for agricultural fields, pastures, and human settlements. However, during the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, the pace of deforestation accelerated dramatically. Populations were growing, cities were expanding. The demand for agricultural land to feed this growing population was relentless, and layered on top of all this was the insatiable demand for wood and charcoal to sustain the urban and industrial economy. In England, the Great Territorial Survey ordered by William the Conqueror in 1086, the so-called Domesday Book, described a country still abundantly covered by forests, but this abundance had its days numbered. In the following centuries, private landowners and the Crown itself undertook a systematic campaign of forest clearing. Nobles and entrepreneurs offered considerable sums to King John Lackland, for the right to clear royal forests. 4,000 oaks were felled just for the construction of Windsor Castle in the 14th century. In France, the situation was similar. In Douai, in the north of the country, the price of wooden coffins rose so much that poor families began to rent them only for the funeral ceremony, after which the gravedigger would disinter the body and recycle the coffin. This macabre anecdote vividly illustrates the timber shortage that was hitting some regions of medieval Europe as early as the late 13th century. In the eastern portion of the continent, particularly in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, the situation was aggravated by the presence of intense mining and metal smelting activities. The production of silver and copper in this region depended entirely on charcoal, and the demand was so great that the surrounding forests were exploited relentlessly. Archaeological and anthropological studies conducted at medieval smelting sites in the Harz Mountains revealed that the composition of the region's forests was profoundly altered by exploitation for charcoal production, to the point that the original vegetation can no longer be reconstructed from the current landscape. In central Belgium, research on ancient carbonization kilns revealed an equally dramatic ecological transformation. During the early medieval period, between the 7th and 10th centuries, the region's kilns were dominated by beech, indicating that the primordial forests were predominantly composed of this species. However, in kilns dating from the High Middle Ages, between the 11th and 13th centuries, beech was almost entirely replaced by oak, a species that tolerates light better and thrives in degraded forests. This change directly reflects the degradation of primordial forests caused by intensive exploitation for charcoal production. This scientific evidence paints a disturbing picture. The charcoal economy, which had sustained the urban and industrial expansion of medieval Europe for centuries, was consuming the very foundation upon which it rested. The forests that provided the raw material were shrinking, and with them shrank the capacity to produce the fuel upon which civilization depended. Estimates suggest that by the beginning of the 14th century, at least 70% of the forests in France, England, and the eastern part of Germany had been removed for agricultural expansion, construction, and energy production. And herein lies one of the most remarkable paradoxes of medieval history. The same fuel that had enabled the rise of cities, the construction of cathedrals, and the flourishing of metallurgy was, through its excessive consumption, undermining the conditions that made its own production possible. It was an energy crisis in slow motion, whose effects accumulated over generations, becoming fully visible only when it was already difficult to reverse them. Let us return now to the direct impact of charcoal on the built landscape of medieval cities, for it is there that its importance becomes most tangible and concrete. Consider, for a moment, a medieval cathedral. These monumental structures, which still inspire awe today, were extraordinary feats of engineering for their time. Their towers rose to impressive heights, their stone arches defied gravity, and their stained glass windows transformed sunlight into colorful narratives. But behind all this visible beauty was an invisible infrastructure, entirely dependent on charcoal. The construction of a cathedral required immense quantities of iron. Every stone had to be cut and shaped with iron tools. Scaffolding was secured with iron clamps and hooks. Doors were supported by iron hinges. Stained glass windows were mounted in lead frames which, in turn, were fixed to iron structures. The grills, gates, chandeliers, bells, and their mechanisms, everything depended on iron. And every piece of iron had been forged in a workshop fueled by charcoal. Without charcoal, there would be no tools to cut the stone. Without tools to cut the stone, there would be no cathedrals. The same reasoning applies to medieval fortifications, castles, walls, and defensive towers that defined the political landscape of the time. Every gate had its hinges, every drawbridge had its chains, every weapon had its blade. And all of this passed, at some point in its manufacture, through a charcoal-fired forge. The medieval city, in all its complexity, was literally built on foundations of iron, and this iron, in turn, was the product of a fuel manufactured deep in the forests by men whom the very society that sustained them preferred to ignore. The irony of this situation did not go unnoticed, even at the time. Charcoal burners, despite being socially marginalized, held considerable indirect economic power. Any interruption in the supply of charcoal could paralyze the production of tools and weapons, with potentially catastrophic consequences for cities and armies. This vulnerability was not merely theoretical. In regions where forests were exhausted by overexploitation, iron industries were forced to shut down their activities. In England, extensive iron production operations in the forests of Knaresborough and Craven, both in Yorkshire, had to be closed entirely for lack of fuel. This growing shortage of wood and charcoal did not hit all regions of Europe at the same time or with the same intensity. The most urbanized and industrialized areas were the first to feel the effects, while more remote and less populated regions continued to have abundant forests for longer. But the general trend was unequivocal. Medieval Europe was consuming its forest resources at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. It was in this context of increasing scarcity that an unlikely and deeply unpopular substitute emerged on the European stage: mineral coal, known at the time as sea coal. This peculiar name derived from the fact that, in England, mineral coal was often collected on beaches, where fragments from coastal or underwater deposits were washed up by the waves. On other occasions, it was transported by sea from the mines of Newcastle in northeast England to London and other southern cities. Mineral coal was a fundamentally different fuel from charcoal. While charcoal was a manufactured pure product that burned cleanly and consistently, mineral coal was a natural sedimentary rock, loaded with impurities such as sulfur and bitumen. When burned, it produced a thick, acrid and fetid smoke that irritated the eyes, lungs and sense of smell. For a population accustomed to the relatively mild aroma of wood and charcoal smoke, the smell of mineral coal was intolerable. But the intolerance went beyond mere olfactory discomfort. Mineral coal was also an inferior fuel for many industrial applications, especially metallurgy. The sulfur present in mineral coal contaminated the iron during the forging process, making it brittle and unusable at high temperatures. This contamination, technically known as hot shortness, meant that mineral coal simply could not replace charcoal in the production of high-quality iron. Blacksmiths rejected mineral coal vehemently, and with good reason. Iron forged with sulfur-contaminated coal was iron that crumbled under the hammer, incapable of maintaining its shape or its strength. Despite all these disadvantages, the adoption of mineral coal was, in many cases, a matter of pure necessity. In London, which by the beginning of the 13th century housed a rapidly growing population of about 20,000 inhabitants, firewood and charcoal had to be transported from ever greater distances at ever higher costs. Mineral coal, though inferior and unpleasant, was cheap and abundant. From 1228, documentary records attest that mineral coal from northeast England was being regularly transported to London. Throughout the 13th century, the trade in mineral coal expanded rapidly, driven by the growing shortage of alternatives. The reaction of the London population was vigorous and hostile. The pollution caused by burning mineral coal transformed London's air into something suffocating and nauseating. In 1257, the mother of King Henry III, Queen Eleanor of Provence, was forced to leave Nottingham Castle due to the unbearable smoke from mineral coal polluting the region's air. In 1285, citizens of London formally protested to the king, asking for a ban on the use of mineral coal in the city. Two royal commissions were established in the 1280s to assess the impact of lime kilns using mineral coal, and the conclusions were severe. One of the commissions declared that the air was being infected and corrupted, endangering the health of those who frequented and inhabited the affected areas. Finally, in 1306, King Edward I issued a proclamation prohibiting the use of mineral coal in London's lime kilns, while Parliament was in session. The penalties provided were severe. There are records indicating that at least one person may have been executed for violating this ban during the reign of Edward I. However, enforcement of the law was generally weak, the need was constant, and the prohibition never managed to significantly reduce the amount of mineral coal burned in the city. This battle between economic necessity and environmental quality, so familiar to the contemporary observer, was being fought on the streets of London more than 700 years ago. And what makes this story even more remarkable is that it was caused, at its root, by the depletion of a natural resource that medieval civilization had considered inexhaustible, the forests and the charcoal they produced. The fate of the medieval charcoal economy was sealed by a combination of factors that accumulated over centuries. Progressive deforestation reduced the supply of wood. Competition for agricultural land limited the areas available for forest management. Population growth increased the demand for fuel, and wars accelerated the consumption of resources at an unsustainable pace. The result was an energy crisis of continental proportions that forced Europe to seek alternatives, however imperfect and unpleasant they might be. It is significant to note that the Black Death itself, which devastated Europe starting in 1347, provided a temporary and involuntary relief for this crisis. With the death of a substantial portion of the European population, the pressure on forests decreased drastically. Cities and towns were abandoned, fields were left fallow, and forests began to regenerate in areas that had been deforested for centuries. The demand for charcoal fell proportionally to the reduction in population and economic activity. For a period, the balance between supply and demand was partially restored, but this restoration was temporary. As the European population recovered throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, the pressure on forests returned with renewed intensity, and this time, with forest resources even more reduced than before the plague, the energy crisis became even more acute. It was in this context that mineral coal, despite all its disadvantages, finally established itself as the dominant fuel of the European economy, paving the way over the following centuries for the Industrial Revolution. The transition from charcoal to mineral coal was not, therefore, the result of a deliberate choice or a brilliant technological innovation. It was, to a large extent, a desperate response to a resource crisis that medieval civilization itself had created, and this transition had consequences that reverberate to this day. Mineral coal, whose adoption was driven by the shortage of charcoal, became the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution, which transformed the modern world and which, in turn, created the environmental challenges with which humanity grapples today. There is something deeply revealing in this chain of causality. The medieval charcoal burners, working at their smoking piles in the depths of European forests, could not have imagined that their silent trade was shaping the energy future of the planet. They could not have foreseen that the depletion of forests would force the adoption of a fossil fuel that, centuries later, would alter the composition of the Earth's atmosphere. But the line connecting those earth-covered piles of wood to contemporary climate challenges is direct and unbroken. This connection is a powerful reminder that energy crises are not exclusive to the modern world. Humanity has already faced in the past the challenge of exhausting a seemingly inexhaustible energy resource and being forced to seek imperfect alternatives. The history of medieval charcoal shows that energy transitions are rarely smooth or voluntary. They are, almost always, the result of pressures accumulated over decades or centuries. And what remains today of that invisible economy that sustained the European Middle Ages? In the forests of Central Europe, archaeologists still find the remains of the circular platforms where the carbonization piles were assembled. These subtle marks on the ground, visible only with modern mapping technologies such as LiDAR, light detection and ranging, are the last physical testimonies of an industry that moved entire economies. In some regions of Romania, Poland, Slovenia and Switzerland, the art of charcoal production in traditional piles is still practiced, though on a tiny scale and more as cultural preservation than as a relevant economic activity. In 2014, in Germany, the art of charcoal production and tar distillation was incorporated into the Intangible Cultural Heritage Register, a late recognition of the historical importance of this activity. But the most lasting legacy of the medieval charcoal burners is not in the forests or the heritage registers. It is in the iron. It is in the nails that still hold up centuries-old structures across Europe. It is in the hinges of cathedral doors that still open and close centuries after being forged. It is in the tools whose direct descendants are still used by artisans worldwide. Every piece of medieval iron that has survived to our day is a silent testimony to the work of those solitary men who lived in the forests, covered in soot, monitoring the color of the smoke while the wood slowly transformed into the fuel that fed a civilization. The history of medieval charcoal is ultimately a story about the relationship between humanity and its natural resources. It is a story about ingenuity and destruction, about creation and exhaustion, about the human capacity to develop brilliant solutions for immediate problems without anticipating the long-term consequences. It is a story that reminds us that every civilization depends on an energy base, and that the fate of that energy base is, to a large extent, the fate of the civilization itself. The kilns of the medieval charcoal burners cooled long ago. The forests they fed have regenerated in some places and disappeared permanently in others. The cities that depended on their work grew, transformed, and remain standing. But the lesson remains, inscribed not only in the iron foundations of medieval buildings, but in the very trajectory of European civilization. The fuel that builds a world can, if used without prudence, also be the fuel that consumes the foundations of that same world. And so when we walk the streets of an ancient European city today, when we admire the arches of a Gothic cathedral or touch the iron grills of a centuries-old gate, we are, without knowing it, touching the legacy of those anonymous charcoal burners who lived and worked in the shadows of the medieval forests. Their work, as invisible as it was essential, built the iron skeleton upon which medieval Europe rose. And although their names have been forgotten by history, the product of their craft remains, silent and indestructible, as a testimony to the underground economy that fed the heart of an entire civilization. Now, before we finish, think about this. Just as the charcoal burners patiently monitored the smoke from their piles to ensure the fire did not go out, we too depend on attentive people who keep the flames of knowledge alive. If this narrative ignited a curiosity in you about the forgotten backstages of history, then you are exactly the kind of person who makes this channel possible. Subscribe to follow more documentaries like this. Leave your comment telling us which aspect of this story most caught your attention, and if this content made a difference in your day, share it with someone who is also fascinated by the hidden gears that move the world. Every subscription, every like, every comment is the fuel that keeps this forge burning. We'll see you in the next documentary.